welcome to our session with Hennie Geldenhuys today, the psychosomatic and embodied portal to wellness, health, and integral healing. And I'd like to go ahead and introduce our conversation partner for today's session. Dr. Hennie Geldenhuys is a certified transpersonal coach and trainer and hypnotherapist and NLP practitioner. He's also a medical doctor with an interest in integrative health and the emergence of the transpersonal in health and well-being. In addition to his clinical background as a physician and coach, Hennie has a wide experience in academia and research. He is an experienced trainer and facilitator in coaching, philosophy, methodology and practice, as well as research ethics. Hennie is a personal tutor at Aleph Trust, and he teaches on the integrative medicine and transpersonal coaching psychology courses. Good to have you with us today, Hennie.
Hello, it's good to be here. Thank you.
So today's session is 1 hour. Let's get straight into it. I've got a few questions prepared, but anybody at any time is more than welcome to ask your questions. And we would prefer, if it's okay with you, to hear you verbalizing those questions, because then we can hopefully weave that into the dialogue and conversation we'll be having today. You're welcome, if you have any mic issues or if it's your personal preference, to place your question in the text chat window, but do feel free to speak out at any time. I'll get the ball rolling with the first question then. So, Hennie, what do we mean by the psychosomatic, and how does our view of the body influence how we approach the psychosomatic?
Yes, I mean, obviously a good question. And I wish I could say it was easy to answer the question. The challenge we have is that to answer the question of what we mean by the psychosomatic, in a sense, there's no way that we can really answer that question from outside of ourselves. So how you answer the question of what the psychosomatic is depends on what your view of the body is and what the meaning of our physical selves are. And I suspect that many of us, we have a sort of a meta program, don't we? We have a sort of an instinctive way of approaching our physical selves, our somatic selves. And I suspect that a lot of that meta programming, we don't even know about it. It's unconscious. And we might say one thing, but we actually have a different perception of who and what we are. And so to answer that question, perhaps we do need to look at sort of some potential models. And I would suggest that each of you consider where along this spectrum of models you might find yourself. For example, at the one end, there might be people who say that we are purely physical beings. We are these beautiful, complicated, biological machines in a way, entities, this beautiful complex organism that the human body is. That's the sort of, I suppose, more narrow physical somatic model. But I do suspect that it's less prevalent than we actually think. If you take a half a step back from that model, then you might say that, yes, we are these beautiful, complex, biological entities, but that does enable us to have metaphysical experiences. And so because of our bodies, we have perceptions of spirituality, we have emotions, we have all those abstract, non-physical experiences, but only as long as the body exists. Right on the other end of the scale, you might have people who say, well, in fact, we are just like, we're purely spiritual energies. We're only energy, and the body is actually just an illusion, doesn't really exist, and so maybe it's not really all that important. And if you take a half a step back from that view, you might say, well, we're actually spirit just inhabiting a physical body. The classic saying of we are spiritual beings having a somatic experience. That also has its issues. I mean, I don't know about you, but I find myself somewhere in between and sometimes moving between those different extremes. But think about that. Think about how you experience your body. The nice thing about coaching, and this is how I look at it. I sidestep this whole issue about what we mean by the psychosomatic and what the meaning of the body is, because to me, as a coach, as a practitioner, all that really matters about what the psychosomatic is what it is for my client. It's how they define it. It's how they experience it. My job is to adapt to their view and not to sort of impose my view on anyone else. So that's a really long-winded way of answering what the psychosomatic is, Jevon. I haven't really answered the question, but maybe that's the point.
Starting artfully vague is just fine, Hennie. Let's try to pin that down a bit if we can. Most people in this session with us today and those watching the recording later on are interested in the application of the psychosomatic in the context of coaching, specifically transpersonal oriented coaching. So for this audience, how does the psychosomatic show up in that coaching context? What's its prevalence? How do we work with it? How do we make sense of it as coaches?
Well, first of all, there's sort of nothing mystical about this. We all know that our metaphysical type experience, spiritual experiences, emotional experience leave footprints in the body. We know that. I mean, it's something as simple as blushing when you're embarrassed or when you are nervous or anxious. You know the feeling, don't you? You start perspiring and your heart starts beating faster. Your breath becomes shallower. And also when you are in a more relaxed, perhaps mindful state, how your breathing pattern changes and you start breathing more slowly and you just feel physically different. But of course, there are physical manifestations which are beyond what we might consider to be normal experiences, if there is such a thing. And so I could tell you about a whole lot of real life case scenarios. For example, and there are many of those, you could come up with many of your own. I could think of a medical colleague of mine. He was a specialist, a surgeon who had this inexplicable paralysis of his operating hand, the arm with which he operates, and all the tests were negative. I'm sure you can recall clients or people that you know who presented with things like chronic back pain or inflammatory bowel disease or fibromyalgia, inexplicable pain, fatigue. And very often, there's no physical cause to be found. All the tests are negative. This person feels almost as if they're falling through the cracks. They feel frustrated because this is their experience, but it seems as if no one can really tell them what's happening. So these, in my experience, are the type of things that we as coaches or therapists or practitioners of whatever kind might be confronted with. And I mean, I would almost go as far as to say that there is no issue with which a client can present that doesn't have some psychosomatic component. And if we don't manage that, then we're sort of doing half a job.
Hennie, that's interesting. Thank you. So does it stand to reason then, if a client is presenting an issue and it's not necessarily a physiological issue, it's not an ache or pain or a health matter as such, that even their stressful situation or relationship dilemma, whatever, will have a manifestation in the body? And if it is to have a manifestation in the body, then how can we work with that as coaches?
Yes. Well, I mean, on a number of different levels. One could say, for example, that the physical body is like an entry point into the system. If we see a human and the society of humans as just very complex systems, which they are, then of course all the different elements of the somatic of the physical body are part of that very complex system, which is actually quite useful for us as coaches, because if someone is presenting with an issue and maybe they're all, up in their head, or maybe it's a very abstract issue, or that's how they're experiencing it, maybe that's the pattern of the issue in the first place. And then it becomes very useful for us to utilize the body as an entry point into that system to sort of address the pattern that is reinforcing the issue. And so I think bringing in the body, and this is a very prominent philosophy in transpersonal coaching, isn't it? We like to ground things into the body. We focus on our experience of the somatic, because that is part of our human experience. And so it becomes a useful tool, but not only that, I think it becomes a useful cue, because if we can start picking up on those very subtle somatic cues, things like symptoms, things like physical experiences, but also things like movements of the body or facial expressions, or, the client is talking about one thing and they're pointing to a certain area of their body, or they're using certain words that have a sort of a physical component to them. I have a knot in my stomach, gives me a kink in my neck, that sort of thing. It gives us the opportunity to use that languaging, to use those metaphors that our client brings to us, to integrate that into our entire coaching process. And so as it is in life, where the somatic is integrated into the spiritual and the emotional and the psychological, so that is reflected into our coaching approach.
Okay, so it seems like we really can't get away with this thing that is the body. It's going to come with us wherever we go. So assuming that clients will have a body when they come to coaching, then we should be able to help them to tune into the somatic component of the issue or the somatic experience as it's unfolding within the session. And I'm particularly curious in when we bring the client's attention to what is present in the body and in the somatic field, what value does that have to the coaching process? How can that be a point of leverage that deepens or extends the process in a beneficial way for the client?
Yeah, that's a core point. That's a core consideration, isn't it? I think what we do when we help our client, when we hold the space for our client to be in their bodies, as it were, it helps to ground the process, but it also helps to integrate them, because sometimes when we have an issue, it's because we are probably in what we would call tunnel vision. And so we are focusing on certain aspects of an experience. And if we neglect our whole experience, then that's often what holds the issue in place. And so grounding something in our body brings that physical component. It's more holistic, isn't it? It takes what is maybe just in our minds or in our metaphysical experiences, and it grounds it into something that is sort of very real. But now, in addition to that, it is my hypothesis that there are some very real physiological issues going on as well. And so we can harness the physiological processes that we all have, that we've been evolved to have. And so, for example, we know what the value is of the breath, of working with the breath. Now, the breath is a physiological process, isn't it? And yet it has so many other dimensions when we consider things like shifts in consciousness or mindfulness breathing. So there's an example of a physiological process that we are using as a coaching tool in a way. We know the value of movement. We know something like Jumi, for example, or yoga. We know that if we can bring those movements in, it sort of just, it brings an extra dimension other than just sort of talking about things, doesn't it? I think it's because it leads to that greater integration. It's because it's a form of reframing where we bring our physical selves, and we always have bodies, no matter what. We can only experience anything through the filter of our physical body. So grounding things in our somatic selves, to me, is like the ultimate form of integration.
Hennie, this starts to make more sense now, and reminds me of a couple of cases. So these are general case examples, and the one is of spiritual practitioners who have come for coaching, who are struggling to integrate the spiritual phenomena associated with certain experiences they've had, say, through meditation, attending retreats, or other spiritual practices. And by grounding in the body, as you say, they've been able to identify what's really present for them through another lens, and in a way that helped them to then make sense of their experience in a different way, bringing it into the present of the body and the context of life in which they were operating, help them to integrate that experience into that situation in which it really matters to them. And we talk about that in transpersonal coaching, don't we, as using spiritual insight and phenomena to resolve real life problems, problems that people typically would bring to coaching that have to do with stress at work, relationship issues, and other sort of real life phenomena that we're all confronted by on a day-to-day basis. But there's another sort of set or category of examples of clients that I'm thinking about here, without getting into a particular case, of people that have never really had an awareness of the body, and they've landed up with a diagnosis of some kind, and they may be undergoing a conventional treatment through the medical approach to resolve that physical issue that they've been diagnosed with, but they come to coaching in support of their healing process. And by supporting particular clients that have never really gotten in touch with the way things feel, dropping awareness below the cerebral ways in which they've been thinking about the crisis in their life, and being present with the symptom and the energetic unfolding aspects of experience, they've been able to tune into the body's message. And through aligning awareness with the message that the body's trying to bring into conscious awareness through the symptom, through the medical condition itself, they've discovered proactive ways to go about enhancing their healing journey that had never occurred to them before. And as a consequence of that, healing was really enhanced for these individuals. I can think of some cases, and I'd be glad to share examples, but I don't want to get into unnecessary details at this stage. But I'm wondering what your take is on that,
Yes.
on both categories of examples there, Hennie.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And it's well, that's been my experience as well. I've had many clients. And the irony is that sometimes when we have these physical issues, let's take that category, for example, of people that have these unexplained symptoms. And it's sad that very often by the time they come to a coach, they've sort of been through the system, haven't they? You know, they've been through multiple tests, they've been through to various practitioners, and it seems as if they've just fallen through the cracks. And then they develop secondary problems because they start developing, you know, they become a little cynical, or they become frustrated, or they become anxious, or they become, it's just, you know, they sort of lose a sense of agency, and they're in this loop of, well, whatever, you know, there's no hope for me type of thing. And the irony is that, the practitioners up until that point have asked them about their symptoms or about their physical experience. but they've never really explored the experience. And so you can tell me about your pain, and I can take a medical history about your pain. There's certain things I'll ask you about your pain, but it's mostly information, biographical information about the pain. What type of pain is it? Where is it? When do you get it? You know, how long have you had it? That sort of thing. Okay, fine. You've told me that. Let's move on. How are we going to fix this? Now, as a transpersonal coach, my approach would be completely different. My approach would be, well, I want to know more about the experience of your pain. And I might even, ironically enough, ask them to amplify that symptom. Let's say it's pain or whatever the symptom might be. Obviously, we do it sort of ethically and carefully and within that held space. But I'm really interested in how they are experiencing that physical manifestation, because the body is like a repository. The body is interpreting all the time. It's doing that on our behalf in a way. And so if I want to address what the body is trying to say through that somatic manifestation, then we had better listen. And it's as if we don't listen to our bodies anymore. And it's as if healing in modern times has forgotten about healing. It's more about curing. It's more about fixing and not about listening. And I do believe that if we can facilitate that health space as coaches for clients to engage with their bodies, to actually associate into the experience instead of trying to move on from it, they will eventually move on from it, obviously, through integration. But before you can move on, you have to experience it more deeply. And invariably what happens is that at some point, it changes all on its own. Let's say you have this chronic back pain and no one can find a cause. So let's really associate into that back pain. And you might have certain images around that. You might have certain metaphors that make sense to you. At some point, it changes for you. Maybe the pain doesn't go away, but the image changes, the metaphor changes, the meaning changes. The whole context of the experience starts changing for you. And this seems to be a naturally moving organic process. We don't even have to try to push it away. What we do is we create a space for it. It's as if there's that part of us that is trying to say something. It's using the body and no one is listening. But when you start listening, it feels welcome and says, okay, let's move on, you know? It's magic, isn't it?
It can be magical. It absolutely can be. And it depends on the degree to which I believe the client is willing to participate in the process. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. You know, this is what we need to attend to, which in turn reminds me of attention is what directs energy. Energy flows where attention goes. And to the busy person that's never really been attending to the body and its needs, they've been neglecting those needs, and eventually the body kicks and screams and they'll end up with a diagnosis. I'm reminded of one case in which the client was undergoing chemotherapy for prostate cancer, but it never really brought attention to what this part of his body was trying to communicate to him. And when in the session, through being in open awareness, we then brought attention into the area where the cancer existed, and we tuned into the organs that were affected and into that entire cellular makeup and the metaphoric representation that came to his mind as he brought all of his attention into that area, he suddenly had a revelation. And that revelation was a very clear message. This is what you need to do. This is what I've been trying to tell you all the time, but you haven't been listening because you haven't been paying attention. And so he paid attention for the first time ever. He got a clear message. And I'm happy to report that he's still around today to tell the story himself. And it's amazing what can happen when we pay that quality of attention to the symptoms of the body. Now, this leads me to the placebo effect. Now, Hennie, I'm wondering how can we relate placebo, nocebo, and the psychosomatic? What's the link here?
Yes. This is one of my favorite topics. I love talking about nothing, which is what the placebo actually is, isn't it? Well, first of all, what do we mean by the placebo effect? Also a good question. So, a lot of people have a negative connotation to the word placebo. And so if you can think of better words, any of you, please do let me know, because maybe we should avoid the word placebo, because to me, it's not a negative thing at all. I think it's a magical, mystical, wonderful tool that we have, this placebo. But what is it in essence? In the strict medical sense, a placebo would be when you give someone a treatment that might sound or look like real treatment, but is an inactive substance, and yet it still has an effect. Let's widen that definition, though. So I would say it's it's any intervention that has an indirect effect. So it's not really the content of the intervention, but it's the process of the intervention that has some effect. When that effect is perceived as positive, it's called the placebo effect. When it's perceived as being negative, it's called a nocebo effect. Now, there's a whole body of literature. In fact, there's been decades of research on this. The placebo effect is not really sort of a sideline topic anymore. There's plenty of research and literature on this. And there are a couple of things about this placebo effect that we know. We know, for example, that it seems to be something that activates certain processes in the body. So to me, this is the really important point about the psychosomatic. This to me is the key, in fact, because we have these metaphysical experiences on the one hand. We have those somatic experiences on the other hand, all these physiological processes. What we don't understand is how that one thing leads to the other. And that sort of mystical process that we don't understand is what I call the placebo effect. It's the bridge between our non-somatic experiences and the effects within the body. So if you consider the placebo as being that, then you've opened a very interesting door. Now, we know also that there are certain conditions under which that placebo effect is more prevalent. For example, we know that it's more effective when there's expectancy, okay? When you sort of think something is going to happen, it's probably going to happen, okay? So that leads to the question, so how do we foster expectancy? But it's also linked to things like suggestibility. Now, suggestibility, once again, might have negative connotations. To me, it has positive connotations because it reminds us as transpersonal coaches the value of something like open awareness or shifts in consciousness, shift in awareness, because you are harnessing the power of suggestibility. You're in a more suggestible state. So you're more likely to experience a positive placebo effect, which will lead to healing on physical and metaphysical levels. But there's also the other considerations, isn't there? There's the set and the setting. It's a package deal. It's not just one thing. And so it's the entire experience that we are facilitating as coaches that comes into play. Interestingly enough, the literature says other things. There might even be a genetic component. There might, some people are just more suggestible than others, which also comes into it. But I think there are plenty of areas that we can harness, that we can use. We also know that the placebo effect is especially effective in some conditions. So, for example, when we are amplifying or negating already existing physiological process, pain is a classic example, because we have these natural opioids that our brains are manufacturing, which has a natural painkiller effect, to put it very simplistically. So that's why the placebo effect works very well with pain, for example, or with things like the stress response, where we have all this adrenaline and cortisol. We're sort of working with the body instead of against us. So we know that the placebo effect is very useful under those conditions. So to me, when I work with the psychosomatic, it feels as if I am actually working with the placebo effect. I'm using it for healing. I'm trying to integrate all those factors about suggestibility, about expectancy, about conditioning. I'm harnessing the set and the setting. I'm creating that held space. To me, that is utilizing the placebo to facilitate healing. At the same time, there might be a nocebo effect. So there's some conditioning in my client that leads them to this very unpleasant experience. Let's try and unpack that and reframe that nocebo effect to something more positive. I can talk for hours about the placebo and nocebo, but maybe I should stop because we don't have hours, do we?
Hennie, I really love your analogy of the placebo serving as a channel between the metaphysical and the physical, but it's also a tool that we can use constructively as transpersonal coaches. And on that point, Claire has posted a really pertinent question. Is the placebo a catalyst for the intelligence of the body to act? We just don't understand the intelligence yet.
Yes, Claire, I think that's it. You said it much better than I can. Yes, it is. It's a sort of it's a non-cognitive intelligence, isn't it? It's that intuitive, almost mystical intelligence. We can't. It's like our experience of the mystical. So if we see the body, our experience of our body as being mystical, in the sense that we can't really explain it. If I were to ask you, what does it feel like to have a body? You can sort of use a whole lot of analogies and words, but you can't really capture what it is to have a body, is it? It's a sort of a mystical, non-conscious, non-verbal type experience, which means probably that there is an intelligence, there is a very deep intelligence in that our cognitive mind simply can't express or understand. And so I think what Claire is pointing out, and I think it's a really, really good way of putting it, is that we can't access that directly because it's outside the realm of our intellectual understanding. However, we can release it. We can open a channel for that intuitive intelligence that is housed, that is contained within the very essence of our bodies. And that is the way that I think about the placebo. I think that's the tool. I can't do much about helping you to understand or to experience your body, because that you'll have to do on your own. But what I can do is I can harness all those factors around the placebo effect to help you to access that intuitive intelligence. And then the magic is healing is going to happen all on its own, because we are healing organisms. That's what we do. That's what we've been involved to do, is to self-heal. Just sometimes we stand in the way of the self-healing. And so we need to access that healing intelligence.
We can really get in our own way sometimes, don't we? And I think that's largely the scenario that clients bring to coaching. They're experts at focusing on what they don't want. And so it's what they don't want that keeps showing up and perpetuating in their life, physiologically, in their relationships and otherwise. So I think one of the first constructive things we can do in coaching is help clients to identify what is it that they're fixated on, which is the problem. What's triggering the issue? Because that's what their attention is focused on, and the nocebo is creating that ongoingly in their life from what you've described here, Hennie. So if clients can identify what their tunnel awareness is fixated on, and how they're in resistance to that, that's the nocebo at play, then in turn, we can enable them to reopen the aperture of awareness, and from that broader perspective of self and of context, choose more consciously what they want to experience in that context. And from that broader perspective, be more in tune with a range of resources and creativity and wisdom, maybe, that would ordinarily not be available to them in the tunnel awareness. And then the placebo, if I understand you correctly, might then be the conscious intention to have that more expansive sense of self choose what is right for the person in that particular context. And then the coaching conversation is about how to implement that, how to move it forward in the person's life. So I see that as a way in which we can then use the placebo as a channel, tapping into the transpersonal, bringing that into the personal and applying it constructively. Does that resonate with what you're saying, Hennie?
Absolutely does resonate with me, and sometimes, and the context in which I say this, but sometimes coaching feels a little bit like theater to me, doesn't it? There's always a little bit of a, I don't know, I wouldn't say drama about it, but I mean, of course, I mean this in a positive sense. But you must have noticed with many of your clients, that when you get excited, when you see your client as an already healed being, I'm really excited by this. Yes, let's really get into it. And yes, we're actually enjoying this. This is a theatrical process, and we do all these magical things, and we do all these magical processes, and wow, I mean, one could almost say it's like smoke and mirrors, but in a good way, of course. But I think that's also important, okay? Because that getting excited about it, doing, all these things that might feel different to a client, that might feel special, that might even feel mystical to them, the big M word. What are we actually doing? We're actually creating that sense of expectancy, aren't we? We are actually putting them into a more receptive state of awareness, a more suggestible state of awareness. We are reframing their experience. We're taking them out of the tunnel vision with which they came to us in the first place. They just keep talking about this physical symptom. They just keep talking about this issue that they have. And we are allowing them, just for a moment, to entertain a different idea. And I use the word entertain with purpose. And just by doing that, just by that reframe, they suddenly see that things aren't that bad, So yes, okay, let's see what's next. I can imagine a world in which I do feel better. I can imagine a world in which I am no longer this unhappy person. I can imagine a world in which I am going to grow from this. And I'm going to one day look back and say, I'm so grateful that I had this issue in my life. We make it possible for our clients to imagine that, don't we? Which is wonderful. We're in a wonderful role that we play as coaches, aren't we?
Hennie, especially the way you put it, does sound wonderful. Indeed. It's so interesting because even clients who are not ordinarily in touch with the body, its symbols and signals, through the coaching process, tend to identify what's emerging from the unconscious. And as they do, the somatic components of that, as they feel it quite viscerally sometimes within the body. And as we work with that unfolding process with the client, helping them to identify what's emerging very quickly sometimes, what these symbols and physical responses bring the client's attention to is the underlying cause of the problem. And sometimes that underlying cause can be a situation or event in their past. They may even confront a trauma as a consequence of working in this way. And I'm wondering if you have any cautions for coaches who leverage the psychosomatic in terms of trauma response and wounds from the past surfacing in the present.
Yes, I think that's really important. And we had that wonderful discussion last week with Julia Vaughan, didn't we, about trauma. And we recognized then as well that trauma often manifests in the body. In fact, I think it's especially trauma manifests in the body. That's sort of been my experience. And so there is always the possibility that as you explore a somatic manifestation manifestation with a client, you might come across some underlying trauma. Here's a sort of a classic example. I've worked with people who have so-called psychogenic seizures, where they have these seizures as if it were epilepsy, but it's not epilepsy, but it's an atypical type of seizure that you have. The EEGs are all normal, everything is normal. And yet you have these uncontrollable seizures. It's a terrible thing to have, especially because the tests are all negative. So the neurologists say to you, well, I don't know, not my problem. Now, as an example, it is a well-known fact that almost all cases, now think about this, almost all cases of psychogenic seizures have some childhood trauma associated with it. That's what the research shows. It's very often trauma that you experienced as a young child, and there seems to be a particularly high prevalence of sexual trauma, of sexual abuse, that later manifests as psychogenic seizures. Now, I'm just using that as an example, but the same principle, I think, would apply to numerous somatic experiences. Now, we as transpersonal coaches have this very interesting relationship with trauma, don't we? Because we don't specifically go out to work with trauma, but we realize that trauma might make itself known at any point in time during the coaching process. We don't go looking for it, but we're also not afraid to work with it when it arises. But yes, of course, we are also ethical practitioners. And so we need to, a number of things. We need to make sure that we've talked about trauma in a coaching context so that when it does surface, we're okay with it. We're fine. Let's move with it. We have our way of working with it. So that's the first thing. We need to develop an expertise. And I think we need to talk more about trauma in general in coaching, especially transpersonal coaching. The second thing is, of course, we also need to understand our limits. Okay, so we're not going to cut off a client, but if you feel that this is turning into something that you don't feel comfortable with, it might be a time to involve some other colleagues. I love to work in multidisciplinary teams. So it doesn't mean that we're sort of giving up. It just means that we're expanding the resources available to our client. So that's important things about working with trauma. So be ready for it. Don't be afraid of it, but sort of also be very wary of it. And I do think that we don't necessarily have to work with the trauma. So this is another thing that we also talked about last week, isn't it? You might notice there's a trauma, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to talk about it, but we need to notice the pattern around the trauma. And the pattern around the trauma is often a somatic one. This is why there's a relationship, I think, between trauma and somatic manifestations. It's the way that the trauma is being expressed. It's almost as if we are dissociating from the trauma. And this is the prevailing theory about why this occurs. We dissociated from the trauma because we can't deal with it at the time. The trauma was just so overwhelming at the time that we couldn't deal with it. And so we, in a way, our psyche ring fences it. It sort of buries it into our psyche. But at some point, that buried part says, yeah, you can't ignore me anymore, but I don't have words to talk to you. So I'm going to use your body. I'm going to convert. So there's so-called conversion theories about how that dissociation is expressed as somatization. Our body is expressing a part of ourselves that has been pushed away. And there might be various reasons for that, trauma being one of them, of course. And so in a way, again, we are using the language of the body to talk to a part of ourselves that otherwise we can't really reach. Does that answer your question, Jevon?
It does so beautifully. Yes. And as we teach our students, Hennie, don't we? It's a matter of working with what's emerging. And if what emerges is a traumatic memory, then we hold space for the client and anything and everything that they may confront in that session. These students are learning how to hold space for whatever happens through the application of open awareness, being fully present. And then offering questions for the clients to learn from the experience, specifically how it's showing up in the body now, how it's metamorphosizing as the space is held in that self-compassionate manner, and to the extent that the client feels safe in the presence of the coach who's holding space for them, that process remains fluid, it's unfolding consistently, and it typically unfolds toward a release or a resolution of some kind. So we need to, as transpersonal coaches, trust that process. And we can remain trusting of a process to the extent that we're in open awareness. That's been our finding over the last couple of decades of exploring this way of working. And we needn't be therapists or medical practitioners to do this kind of work, provided we're not deliberately associating clients into memories, asking them questions such as, and how does that feel as you're there in that memory and things are happening? Because that can, in fact, be re-traumatizing, and we want to avoid that at all costs. So we'll have them come up with whatever it is that they're realizing, and then they kind of disidentify from what's occurring. They look upon it. We talk about that as the disassociated observer perspective, in which they are connected with an infinite resource of love and wisdom. And from that perspective, looking upon what it is in their past, so that they can learn from that, identify the pattern that has occurred in their life as a consequence of the earlier event or period of life, and then come back to the present to unpack that further, remaining tuned into the body and to that vast reservoir, which open awareness facilitates with ease. So I just wanted to emphasize that transpersonal coaching students on this call have come across this before, but others who are not familiar with this way of working, I want to make sure that it's just articulated in this context. Yes, so I don't know if there's any follow-up from you, Hennie, or anybody else at this time. We've only got 9 minutes left for the session today, so I'm wondering what questions there are from anybody else.
Of course, we would welcome questions. Kelly's also, I mean, there's some nice affirmations in a way, or confirmations in the chat window. Melissa found it very useful, a little discussion on non-epileptic seizures. Kelly's also saying in the chat window, somatic intelligence has helped me to personally to access shame stories that actually holds wisdom that had been pushed into my shadow because of conditioning that has told me it is not good to feel certain ways. Yes, Kelly. Yes, Melissa. That's the magic of working somatically. That's the way of exploring somatic manifestations, is that it bypasses perhaps the cognitive conditioning or the societal conditioning. If we've been said that you can't talk about this because I'm ashamed, or you've pushed it into your unconscious in some reason, working with those somatic metaphors as a way of, it's like a shortcut, isn't it, to the actual underlying issue, to the root cause. We can bypass all the thinking and the shame and the negative emotions. We can sort of go to it directly by exploring what is being expressed in the body. So yes, I agree with you, absolutely.
Just on that word you used there, Hennie, bypass, I might refer to it slightly differently, not necessarily bypassing the negative emotions or anything associated with the trauma, perhaps, but instead of going into those painful feelings and memories, identifying them for what they are and what they're trying to convey to us through the somatic experience, so that we can finally get the learning, and that learning sets us free to create forward momentum in our life again. Hennie, am I saying the same thing or contradicting you?
You are saying the same thing. Okay. Lindy has her hand up.
Unmute Lindy, have your say.
Hi. All right. So thank you. This is a beautiful lecture. I'm a transpersonal therapist. So I work in this way all the time. And just to add to what you're saying, I find the most transformative moments with clients is through the body, for exactly that reason, that you can get away from the frame, the framing that you're giving things that are stopping you from actually healing, and enter into the direct experience through the body, which is immediate. So backing you up.
Thank you, Lindy. Yes. Thank you, Lindy. What does this mean in practice? I mean, a lot of this discussion is it's an interesting discussion. I mean, what does this mean in practice for us as transpersonal coaches? Well, I mean, I think it, as Lindy is saying, it means we respect the body and the manifestations of our human experience in the body. It means that during a session, we might facilitate processes that focus on the experience of the body, like somatically facilitated open awareness, for example. It might mean that we encourage our client to explore what's happening in the body. And we might facilitate a process where we allow them to just hold space for that. We might ask them, how are things changing in your body? How does it feel? Or what does that mean to you? Whichever way in which our client is experiencing it physically. Sometimes they don't know they're experiencing it, but because we are sensitive to the psychosomatic, we might suggest to them that if it's appropriate, that they look out for those cues because they haven't been listening to their body up until now, perhaps. It also means, I think, that as coaches, we watch our clients very carefully. And I use watch here, not necessarily in the visual sense, although that too, but also in a more energetic sense. And it's likely that their bodies are giving us as coaches clues as well. And if we can use those cues, use those clues as cues, as entry points into the system, and weave that into how we are working with our client. We as transpersonal coaches, I would like to think that that is our skill set.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah, we're coaching the client's unconscious mind, and we're doing so through the vehicle of the body, because nobody knows you better than your own body does. Nobody knows the client and their needs better than their body does. And as transpersonal coaches, we respect that the body is also the vessel through which soul, spirit, and the entire transpersonal domain is experienced, as you articulated earlier in our conversation, Hennie. So we're using what's most concrete and identifiable in the body. And that works for the spiritual practitioners as much as it does for the very cognitive, cerebral, heady type clients who have simply never paid sufficient attention to that beautiful body of theirs. So by allowing them to identify and process psychosomatic phenomena as it unfolds for them, we deepen self-awareness, and we might all in this session appreciate that that's what it's all about. Well, we're nearly at full time. I'm wondering if there's a last question from anybody.
Claire has a question.
Very quickly. So just on a sort of point of maybe technique. So I find, say, if someone has a chronic pain or a lot of body pain, they're almost have over-identified in their body. That makes sense, perhaps. So how can you direct them? So if you try to get them to feel into their body, they're going to go straight to the bit that hurts and describe the bit that hurts. How can you, I mean, are you asking them to direct away from that point? Or when you say, like, just sort of what questions might you use, or how would you?
Yes, good question, Claire. Well, I mean, Claire, this is how I would do it, but obviously it would depend on your client and it would depend on many things because we don't have a set way of doing things, do we? But I would actually start off by associating into that pain. And what I mean by that is I would ask my client to explore that pain or that symptom, to in fact amplify it. So I'm not moving on. I'm not asking them to ignore it, you know. And I would use open awareness as a tool for that. And I would actually associate them as much as I can into that unpleasant experience, which sounds ironic, but it works, because they need to experience the full impact of that experience before they can move on. We don't leave them for that long in that experience because it's often an unpleasant experience. But through that experience, we move on. We facilitate. This is like an authentic self-empowerment pattern of coaching, isn't it? You'll recognize that, many of you. So first of all, we associate into the issue, right? We then allow them an expanded space through open awareness to actually dissociate a little bit, but it's not a cold dissociation. It's like a wise dissociation or a warm dissociation. So having just experienced that physical symptom in all its detail and all its goring detail, you now have this oversight perspective where you can look down upon yourself having that experience. You can have certain insights. You can allow it to tell its story, and you can watch that story unfolding down there. You might have certain messages, or you might notice certain things that you haven't noticed before. At the same time, you can access all your wise energy from this expanded state, and perhaps you have some message to send down to that physical symptom, so you can even have a conversation, depending on your client, of course, and how they express things. But you are, in a way, in a coaching context, dialoguing in a way with that thread of that person down there. And then, of course, comes the integration. Then, of course, comes the what next, the next smaller steps. So I would, in fact, relook at the ASE type of processes, because I think they work really, really well for working with physical symptoms as well. So to answer your question, Claire, I would first of all delve into the symptom, but not stay there, if that makes any sense.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Hennie, and in so doing, if I might add, we're not asking the client to now feel that pain, just grin and bear it. We're inviting them to bring all of their awareness into and around, and we reframe pain into sensation, could be intense sensation. And through experiencing the intensity of that sensation in all of its ways in which it can be felt, you know, if it's pain, for example, is it throbbing? Is it numb, tingling, cold, warm? Is it moving? Pain is always moving, by the way. It's always got a movement. Is it moving like this or like that? In which way is this pain moving? And as you identify all of the visceral, kinesthetic, visual, auditory components of that sensation, what is there for you to learn about this? What are its needs? What is this part of you trying to convey to you as a conscious awareness? And then zoom out and look upon it, as Hennie was suggesting, and with that conscious awareness now connected to your source of wisdom, apply the learning. What can you bring forth to serve the needs of that part of you that has just expressed those needs? And then breathe that back into your body and allow that energy to move through you and to shift and to allow for a flow of energy that hasn't been there before. And that can be profoundly healing for a client. It's the body and beyond, and back into the body and into the context in which that matters for the client. So I hope that is a summary of sorts that's useful in some way as we reach full time.